This animation story blends historical facts and real pyramid mysteries with fiction. While based on genuine research, some interpretations remain speculative. The wind howled through the darkened streets of London as a mysterious envelope slid beneath the door of 221B Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes, deep in thought by the fireplace, picked it up, noting the absence of a seal or sender. The paper inside was old, too old. Watson watched as Holmes unfolded the brittle parchment, revealing a cryptic message in faded ink. Beneath the sands, a truth long buried. The pyramids whisper to those who listen. Find the key before it is lost forever. Watson leaned in. Holmes, this is madness. Who sent it? Holmes tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the words. That, Watson, is what we must discover. He stood abruptly, reaching for his coat. Pack your things. We leave for Egypt at dawn. The warm desert wind carried the scent of ancient stone and sand as Sherlock Holmes stood before the towering Great Pyramid of Giza. Watson, his trusted companion, adjusted his hat, wiping the sweat from his brow. Holmes, however, was unaffected by the heat. His piercing eyes scanned the immense limestone blocks, his mind already unraveling the secrets that had baffled historians for centuries. Watson broke the silence. Holmes, I fail to see why we've come all this way. These pyramids have been studied for ages. What could you possibly uncover that others have not? Holmes turned slightly, his expression sharp. Watson, have you ever considered that the answer has been before us all along, but the right question was never asked? Holmes knelt and drew a quick sketch in the sand, a simple diagram of the Great Pyramid. Observe, Watson, he said. The pyramid is aligned with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with an error of no more than 0.05 degrees. Even with modern technology, such precision is difficult to achieve. Watson frowned. But they didn't have compasses. Holmes smirked. Precisely. And yet they found another method. The answer lies in the movement of the sun. With a walking stick, Holmes traced a straight line in the sand. Imagine an ancient Egyptian standing here at dawn, placing a stick into the ground. He marks where its shadow falls and does the same at sunset. By bisecting the arc of the shadow's movement, he finds true north. Watson's eyes widened. A primitive sundial? More than that, Watson. A flawless method. Repeating this daily, correcting for minor errors, they would have refined their measurements to astonishing accuracy. Holmes stood up. Their knowledge was not lacking. It was simply different from ours. Holmes walked toward the edge of the pyramid, his fingers brushing against the stone surface. Now consider this, Watson. The perimeter of the Great Pyramid, when divided by its height, results in a number remarkably close to P 314. Watson scoffed. Surely a coincidence? Holmes turned sharply. Coincidence? Mathematics does not work by coincidence. Taking out a small notebook, he quickly sketched a right-angled triangle. The Egyptians were master builders. They understood the relationships between circles and triangles long before the Greeks named them. If they observed that a circle's circumference is always a fixed ratio of its diameter, they could have incorporated this knowledge into their architecture. He tapped the diagram. They may not have used the symbol P, but they understood its properties. Their pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a monument of mathematical perfection. Watson folded his arms, and yet people assumed they lacked advanced knowledge. Holmes smiled. People assume too much, Watson. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the sands. Holmes climbed onto a small rocky outcrop and gestured for Watson to follow. From this vantage point, the three pyramids stretched across the desert below. Holmes pulled out a small star chart from his coat and compared it to the pyramid positions. His eyes gleamed. Remarkable. Watson sighed. Holmes, I hope you're not going to tell me these stones were placed according to the stars. Holmes smirked. I am telling you precisely that. He pointed to the sky. The three pyramids aligned perfectly with the three stars of Orion's belt. Watson frowned. But why? Holmes exhaled. The Egyptians were not only engineers, they were astronomers. By aligning the pyramids with Orion's belt, they believed they were creating a path to the heavens, a celestial connection between Earth and the stars. Watson was silent for a moment before finally saying, "Holmes, this is beyond logic. You're speaking of rituals, beliefs." Holmes adjusted his coat and stepped down from the rock. Belief, Watson, often hides behind logic, and logic in turn is built upon belief. He looked back at the pyramids, his mind racing. They built a structure that would stand for thousands of years, filled with hidden knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. And yet, we still struggle to understand their full intent. Watson let out a deep sigh. "Holmes, do you ever tire of being right?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Rarely, Watson. Rarely." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Sherlock Holmes knew one thing for certain. There were more secrets yet to be uncovered, and he would not leave Egypt until he had solved them all. Sherlock Holmes stood inside a narrow passage of the Great Pyramid, the air thick with the weight of time. The dim glow of a modern lantern cast flickering shadows on the massive limestone blocks that formed the walls. Watson, ever the skeptic, trailed behind him, observing the ancient architecture with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Holmes placed a hand on the cold stone and murmured, "A tomb, a monument, a machine. Whatever this structure once was, it was not built in ignorance." Watson exhaled. "I must say, Holmes, for a man dedicated to reason, you sound rather mystified yourself." Holmes smirked but said nothing. His mind was already dissecting the first mystery that defied logic. Holmes turned his gaze upward. The passage was dark, yet the surfaces of the walls and ceilings were pristine. No soot, no blackened marks from torches. "Watson, have you noticed something peculiar?" Watson shrugged. "It's an enclosed space. Of course it's dark." Holmes stepped forward. "Precisely. And yet, during construction, workers would have required light to see what they were doing. If they had used torches, surely we would find remnants of soot. But we do not." Watson frowned. "Perhaps they cleaned the walls afterward." Holmes shook his head. "Even in chambers untouched since antiquity, no soot marks have ever been found. This suggests a different source of illumination." He took out his notebook and began writing furiously. What if they did not use fire at all? Ancient texts speak of the Egyptians' deep understanding of materials and energy. Some propose that they may have used highly reflective copper mirrors to channel sunlight deep into the pyramid. Others, more boldly, suggest an early form of chemical or electrical lighting. Watson scoffed. Electrical lighting? In 2500 BCE? Preposterous. Holmes tapped his chin. Or is it? The so-called Baghdad battery, a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, suggests that ancient civilizations may have had rudimentary knowledge of electricity. What if the Egyptians, with their unparalleled engineering skills, harnessed something similar? Watson sighed. You mean to tell me that thousands of years ago they had a lighting system superior to simple flames? Holmes smirked. It would appear so, Watson. Watson groaned. This trip is testing the limits of my understanding. Holmes chuckled. Good. That means we are learning. They moved deeper into the structure. Holmes knelt beside a stone slab and ran his fingers over its surface. There is something unnatural about these stones. Watson raised an eyebrow. In what way? Holmes retrieved a magnifying glass and studied the texture. These are not like ordinary quarried limestone. Microscopic analysis has shown that some blocks contain synthetic elements, tiny crystals, and a unique limestone mixture that does not match any known quarry in Egypt. Watson blinked. Are you suggesting that they did not carve these stones, but rather made them? Holmes stood. That is precisely what the evidence suggests. Some theorists propose that the Egyptians might have used a form of ancient concrete, pouring a semi-liquid stone mixture into molds and allowing it to harden. Watson shook his head. Surely such a method would have left records. Holmes paced. Would it? If this was a lost technique, one passed down through select builders and never recorded in hieroglyphs, it could have faded from history. And yet, the evidence is in the stones themselves. Watson exhaled. If true, that would mean the pyramids were not just built, they were cast. Holmes nodded. And it would explain how they transported such massive blocks with apparent ease. A liquid mixture would have required no hauling at all, only careful placement. Watson's head spun. I must admit, Holmes, I never expected to question how stone itself was made. Holmes smirked. That is the beauty of true investigation, Watson. It forces us to see beyond what we assume to be true. Holmes leaned against the wall, tapping the material between the stones. And now for our final enigma, the mortar. Watson frowned. Mortar is simply a binding agent. What's so mysterious about that? Holmes turned toward him, eyes glinting. This particular mortar is unlike any other known to mankind. It is stronger than the stones themselves, and despite being over 4,500 years old, it has not deteriorated. Watson crossed his arms. Surely we've been able to analyze its composition. Holmes pulled out a small vial, tapping it against his palm. Scientists have studied its chemical structure. But here's the twist. We cannot replicate it. Whatever formula the Egyptians used, it remains beyond our reach. Watson was silent for a moment before shaking his head. So, let me summarize. These pyramids were built with a method we do not fully understand, using materials we cannot replicate, and illuminated by an unknown light source? Holmes smiled. Correct, Watson. And yet we consider ourselves the pinnacle of progress. Watson sighed. Holmes, this may be the first time I truly admit. I am utterly baffled. Holmes glanced up at the towering stone above them. Then we are on the right path, my friend. As the echoes of their footsteps filled the chamber, Sherlock Holmes knew one thing for certain. The greatest mystery of all was not just how the pyramids were built, but why their knowledge was lost. The game was far from over. Holmes stood at the apex of a nearby hill, gazing at the Great Pyramid as the golden hues of sunset cast long shadows across the desert. The sheer precision of its design gnawed at his mind, like a puzzle yet to be solved. Watson, ever the skeptic, sat on a nearby rock, wiping his brow. Holmes, must we analyze every aspect of this monument? It's a marvel, no doubt, but surely even the Egyptians had their limits. Holmes chuckled, eyes still fixed on the colossal structure. Limits, Watson? That is precisely what we must question. If the builders of this pyramid had knowledge beyond their time, we must ask, where did it come from? Holmes knelt and sketched a quick diagram in the sand. He drew a triangle representing the pyramid, then a circle around it. Watson, do you know the ratio between the pyramid's height and the perimeter of its base? Watson sighed. Holmes, I hardly carry such calculations in my head. Holmes smirked. Well, I do. And the answer is 143/200, the same ratio between the Earth's radius and its circumference. Watson blinked. What? Surely that must be a coincidence. Holmes shook his head. Coincidence, Watson? Think. The number 43/200 is not random. It is a multiple of Earth's axial precession cycle, the slow wobble of our planet's rotation that takes roughly 25,120 years to complete. This ratio suggests that the pyramid is not just a tomb, but a precise mathematical model of the Earth itself. Watson exhaled sharply. But that would imply the Egyptians had knowledge of the Earth's dimensions, something we only confirmed in modern times. Holmes nodded. Exactly. And yet, the proportions align perfectly. Either they discovered this knowledge through meticulous measurement, or... He paused, his voice trailing off. Watson frowned. Or? Holmes's voice was low, measured. Or they inherited it from a civilization even older than we realize. Watson shuddered. Holmes, You're beginning to sound as mystical as the pyramid itself, Holmes smirked. Mystical? No, Watson. Merely logical. As the night air cooled, they ventured into the pyramid's interior. The passage was narrow, yet Holmes's focus remained unwavering. He paused, placing his palm against the stone wall. Watson wiped his brow. Curious. It's significantly cooler in here. Holmes turned to him. Not just cooler, Watson. Constant. Watson raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Holmes gestured around them. No matter the season, no matter the temperature outside, the pyramid's interior remains a steady 20 degrees C, 68 degrees, the exact average temperature of Earth itself. Watson frowned. That's impossible. This is the middle of the desert. The heat alone should turn this chamber into an oven. Holmes nodded. And yet, it does not. The structure regulates its own temperature. Tell me, Watson, what do we call such a mechanism today? Watson thought for a moment. A climate control system? Holmes smirked. Precisely. The pyramid appears to have a natural air conditioning system built into its design. Watson scoffed. And how do you propose they achieve such a thing? Holmes ran his fingers over the smooth limestone. Perhaps through strategic placement of ventilation shafts, or maybe the very materials they used had thermal properties we do not yet fully understand. Watson sighed. You're suggesting they engineered an advanced cooling system without modern technology? Holmes smirked. You tell me, Watson. We are standing in the evidence. They emerged once again into the open desert, the stars now gleaming above them. Holmes turned back toward the pyramid, deep in thought. Watson rubbed his temples. Holmes, I must ask, how long do you suppose this thing took to build? Holmes adjusted his hat. Ah, now we come to an even greater mystery. The Great Pyramid is composed of approximately 2.3 million stones, each weighing anywhere from 2 to 30 tons. Watson whistled. That's an absurd number. Holmes nodded. Now, if a single stone were placed every day, construction would take approximately 6,222 years. Yet historians claim it was built in just 20 years. Watson's eyes widened. That means they would have had to place a stone every 2.5 minutes, non-stop, for 2 decades. Holmes smiled. Now tell me, Watson, how does one accomplish such a feat without cranes, modern tools, or machinery? Watson was silent. Holmes continued. Either the labor force was beyond anything recorded in history, or they possessed methods of construction that have been completely lost to time. Watson sighed. I dread asking, but what do you think? Holmes exhaled. If they were pouring the stones rather than carving them, as we previously discussed, that would explain some of the speed. But even then, the logistics of lifting, placing, and aligning such massive blocks at such an incredible rate defy all logical explanation. Watson crossed his arms. Are you suggesting some lost technology was at work? Holmes turned back to the pyramid, his voice low. I am suggesting, Watson, that we may not be asking the right questions. Silence hung between them as they stared at the ancient colossus, its secrets whispering through the wind. Holmes took a deep breath. We came here seeking truth, but the truth, it seems, is far older than we ever imagined. Watson shook his head. Holmes, for the first time, I believe we are investigating something beyond deduction. Holmes smirked. Then, Watson, we must deduce harder. The desert wind howled as Sherlock Holmes stood in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, knowing full well that the game had only just begun. Holmes gazed at the Great Pyramid. Watson, this is no mere tomb. It's a message, a knowledge beyond its time. Watson sighed. And the answer? Holmes smirked. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. As the desert wind whispered through the stones, they turned away, leaving the enigma of the pyramids behind.